Well, we're going to continue today our series called Not Okay. It's a focus for 3 weeks on mental health. And before I get to that, before I get into that message, I just want to do what I do each week and say hello to the West Lafayette campus. You're part of our church. We're glad that you're joining us. Those that are joining us online, hey, we're glad that you're with us no matter where you're watching us from. Would you help me to welcome those people to our service today? And as I get started, I just want to point you to a few resources. A couple I mentioned in my message last week, and a couple are things that I was asked about after the service last week when we started this series on mental health. The first 2 things I want to mention are resources that are in our community center. One is Celebrate Recovery. That happens every Thursday. That's for people with all kinds of things going in their lives, habits, hang-ups, hurts, to be able to go there and address it in a Christian context and be pointed to Jesus Christ and to the Bible to find freedom in these areas. And so that's happening on Thursday nights. Celebrate Recovery. You could ask about it if you have questions about it at our guest connections counter. Secondly, I want to mention River of Hope. That is a grief support ministry that happens in our community center, and I'm mentioning it to you because it is designed for people ages 4 through adult. And so if you or someone you know is struggling with the loss of someone that they loved or who's close to them, it could have happened even a while ago, but there's really some work to be done to find closure, to find healing. That is a great resource for you right in our community center right here in Lafayette. Then I want to mention to you, because many people asked me about it after the service, about where we point people in terms of finding counseling resources in our community. There are 2 great sources that I want to mention to you. I'm sure there are others. I'm sure there are other great counselors in our community, but I just want to mention 2 practices that are making a difference. Both of these have people in them who are either certified or licensed in the areas of therapy and in terms of counseling. And the first one I want to mention, which is Families United. You can learn more about them online. Families United actually receives insurance. They'll work with you on insurance as well as Medicare and other things. And they have people who have worked for a long time in all kinds of fields and areas of need in people's lives. Great practice. Their kind of central office is in Attica, but they do have an office here in Lafayette as well as elsewhere. Please take note of Families United. And then the second group I wanted to mention, Families United, by the way, Christians that work in that practice. The second one I want to mention is also a Christian counseling practice that's in West Lafayette, and it is called Wellspring Counseling Center. It is also a fee-for-service. Both of these have like sliding scales. They work with children and adults. And so if this is something you're interested in, Families United and Wellspring, I just want to commend you to them. Well, last week, as we started this series, Not Okay, I'd say that easily in over 9 years here at River City Church, I've never received quite the kind of feedback that I have from this series. It seemed to touch many people. It strikes a chord with people who are either going through their own challenges or who they know someone who is. And that's because according to the National Institute of Mental Health, mental illnesses are common in the United States. Nearly 1 in 5 persons in the U.S. live with a mental illness. In 2017, that was 46.6 million adults. Mental illnesses include a variety of conditions that vary in degree of severity, ranging from mild to moderate to severe. Depression and anxiety, disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia, or eating disorders, or addictions of all kinds, or self-harm like cutting yourself, or something like attention deficit disorder. All these things and more speak to issues related to mental health. And when we speak of mental health or mental illness, we're talking about a situation where a person either consciously or subconsciously can't seem to get control of their feelings or their thoughts, and where the negative emotion or imagination becomes dominant. And what we've been saying about mental illness in this series is that everyone experiences some kind of challenge to their mental health because of the stresses that come with life. If you've never had an issue like this, that's great, but it's probably likely at some point you will face a problem like this. We're also making the point that mental health challenges are the result of living in a broken world where people get broken in our world. And I'm also making the assumption that while God can heal these issues and help us to move beyond them, it's kind of like a physical illness. God may heal it, but you may also go to the doctor. And so you may need to, if you are facing issues like this, you may need to get medical or professional counseling. Some people may need to take medication even for a time to address their mental health issues. And no matter where you are, recognize that if you have problems like this that continue to be present or maybe taking you down, see a doctor. Find a counselor. One of the most hopeful things about the Bible is that it addresses mental health. In this series, we focused last week on getting a perspective when it comes to mental health. And this week, we're going to be addressing how to deal with this if you're dealing with a mental health challenge in your own life. And next week, we'll be looking at how to provide love and care for someone in your own life who maybe is facing an issue like this. And we're not without light, like I said, because the Bible addresses this. One of the most common metaphors in the Scriptures that addresses mental health is the metaphor of darkness. There are two kinds of darkness in the Bible. There's outer darkness, that's things going on in my life, circumstances that are bringing me down. And then there's inward darkness. That's where my mind, my feelings, my spirit is somehow suffering. And this is where the Bible seems to focus a lot of its energy in helping us to understand ourselves when it talks about darkness. The book of Psalms, it's in the middle of the Bible. It's the biggest book of the Bible. The book of Psalms deals a lot with people who are suffering this kind of inward darkness. We find a lot of the Psalms, for example, address depression. They address people, they're prayed by people who are suffering themselves. And usually in the Psalms, they start out negative, where the psalmist is somewhat disoriented by how things have gone or by life, or like they feel like God's not there. And then at the end of the psalm, they kind of like straighten themselves up and say, well, I'm going to trust in you anyway, or I'm going to praise God anyway. But there are a couple of psalms that aren't like that at all. The theme is the darkness from the beginning to the end. And one of those psalms is Psalm 88. After the psalmist in Psalm 88 blames God for his problems, and he asks God a number of sarcastic, bitter questions, he ends his prayer like this. He says, from my youth, in other words, he's been suffering a really long time. From my youth, I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. In other words, he's suffered for so long, he's blaming God for his problems. What Many of us do. And it seems like that's all he can see. All he can see is his disappointment and his pain. Then he goes on to say this. He says that all day long, he says, your wrath has swept over me, your terrors have destroyed me. All day long, they have destroyed me like a flood. They've completely engulfed me. I'm drowning in my troubles, the psalmist is saying. He says, you, God, you've done this to me. God, you have taken from me friend and neighbor. You know, that's what happens a lot when we're dealing with mental illness, is that one of the insidious aspects of mental illness is we don't want to tell anyone what we're going through, and so we self-isolate. That's what the psalmist here appears to be doing. He's lost everyone around him he cares about. He says, darkness is my closest friend. And it's interesting because the way that this psalm is arranged in the original language in Hebrew is that actually the last word of this psalm is darkness. Darkness. And when I look at a prayer like this, I think, well, why would God put a prayer like this in his word? Why would he put a prayer from a person who is so bitter and angry they can't see straight? They're hurting so much, their perspective isn't quite right. Why would God put something like this in his word? Well, I think it's there because, for one, the Bible is realistic. It's true to life. The Bible's not trying to get us to believe something that's not true or to imagine that life is different than it is. The Bible wants us to actually come to terms with how life actually is. Yesterday, I was putting in light bulbs in different places around my house, and it's always great when you get the right light bulb, because the groove fits perfectly, and that's the way the Bible is. The Bible it fits with life. It's true to life, and so I think, for one, that's why a psalm like this is present in the Bible, because this is where many people are at, or this is where they end up. But I think also a prayer like this is here in the Bible because God wants us to have a mature perspective on our own suffering. People of faith can suffer. People of faith can pray prayers like this one. But here, I think here in this psalm, we also should understand a few things. The psalm is wanting to communicate to us a few things that are important for us to grasp. And particularly they relate to people when they're going through challenges to their mental health. So the first thing that I think this psalm suggests to us is this: it's that suffering can go so deep and long that it impacts your thinking and emotions. Particularly if you're dealing with a problem like a chronic health or pain issue, or you're trying to deal with the aftermath of a death of someone close to you in your life, or you're dealing with a broken relationship or a divorce, or a sudden transition in your life, like you've lost your job, you just didn't see it coming. When you're suffering over it can end up, something like that can end up going on a long time in your life. My wife twice now has gone through cancer, and I have been amazed each time that it actually takes as long for her to get through it and to get better as it does. And the same is true of mental health issues. Psalm 39 is another psalm that ends on a very sad note. The writer, he's dealing with his own profound darkness. And he says, "Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner." God, it's like I don't even know you. It's like we don't even speak the same language. God, I dwell with you as a stranger. God, it's like I don't even know you and you don't know me. And he says, as all my ancestors were. In other words, I'm just kind of living out this same pathetic pattern that my family did before me. And he says this to God, look away from me that I may enjoy life again. In other words, God, just leave me alone so that I can be happy for a little bit. He says, before I depart and am no more. God, just look away from me. Just leave me alone so that I can die in happiness. Well, boy, I don't know why. I'd like to know some answers to some other questions from God, but God sees fit to put something like this in the Bible because he's wanting for us to understand something. We want for God to fix our problems quickly. We want it to be wrapped up. And when you're dealing with mental health challenges, you're dealing with something, as I said, that will take a significant amount of time. I think of a friend of mine that I spoke to recently, one of the good friends of my life. About 6 months ago, he suffered a mental breakdown. He was very responsible, professional person. And he's responsible for many people and a lot of money. And he had this breakdown so severe that he found himself in a psychiatric hospital. They took his shoelaces away from him so that he couldn't find a way to harm himself like that. And he spent a week there, and he got on some medication, and he dealt with a lot of kind of occupational therapy and some small groups and this kind of thing. And I saw him recently, and he said to me, he says, I'm better than I was. I'm back to my job. I'm living my life. He says, but somehow my brain is still not completely right. He says, I don't know how long this will take. Sometimes suffering like this, suffering of interior darkness, it can go on a very long time. Something that Psalm 88, I think, gets through to us further is this idea. It's that our expectations of who God is or how we might suffer can set us up for deeper troubles. What do I mean by that? I mean that one of the things that can make our troubles worse is when we imagine that we won't experience trouble in life. Sometimes people express to my wife and me, in essence, that they don't deserve the kind of trouble they have in life because they're doing all the right things. They pray enough, they give enough, they read their Bible every day, they give generously of their time to serve others or to serve those in need, and so why am I experiencing these kinds of disappointments in life? You need to think about that. And in fact, I think an entire book of the Bible addresses those kinds of notions precisely. Because many of us, we're in a transactional relationship with God. In other words, we've come to God and we serve Him, and one of the things that we look for is for Him to bless us or spare us of trouble. But the book of Job addresses exactly that notion. In the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, Satan comes into the presence of God, and God says, hey, have you seen my servant Job? Isn't he great? Job lives this kind of spotless, perfect life. He's a righteous person. He even makes sacrifices on his kids' behalf, just in case they somehow have sinned against God, and everything is just right with him. And Satan says, well, does Job fear God for nothing? Isn't he looking for something from you for doing the right thing? And Satan says, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. You know, you don't have to answer the question, but I would guess that most of us, on some level, we expect for God to give us blessing for doing the right thing. Maybe at the very beginning of our relationship with God, we said, God, save me. I'm looking for you to help me somehow. And that was the basis for why we're following God. And the thing is, if we stay like that, we'll be up and down based on what's happened this week. If we're pinning our hopes to whether or not God will bless us and spare us from suffering that we think we don't deserve, we're always going to be unstable people. And what's interesting here in the book of Job is that Job then, it kind of goes on. He's got 3 friends who show up, and they tell him he's bad for different reasons. And then God says at the end of Job, you've honored me, so I'm going to bless you. And when you read Job, you think, well, how did he honor God? I mean, he's depressed the whole time. He's complaining to God the whole time, saying, Lord, I've done everything right. Why am I suffering? I think Job honors God, and that God blesses him because even though he's complaining, even though he's bringing his troubles to God, even though he's suffering and he's telling God all about it, he nonetheless doesn't ever turn from God. He prays all those complaints to God. And so he defeats Satan. Satan said, he'll curse you. Job never did. He doesn't turn away from God because he's not getting anything out of the relationship. And I would guess for many of us, that's not quite where we're coming from in our relationship with God. Have you ever been used by someone? Has anyone ever made it seem like they're your friend because they want something from you, or they want a contact that you have, or they want you to sign a sales agreement or whatever it is, and you hate it? It feels awful. Well, how do you think that feels to God when we use God? Because we want for him to make everything perfect. And in the psalm that we looked at, he said, darkness is my closest friend. How do you live? How do you persevere when you're going through that kind of suffering on the inside? You remain faithful. And when you remain faithful, even when you're suffering in ways that you can't explain, it will change you. It will cause you to become a stable, a strong person. It's that kind of experience that will actually lead you to greatness. I think here in Psalm 88, the psalm all about darkness and experiencing trouble. I think that Psalm 88 also suggests this to us: there's no better place to learn about the grace of God than in darkness. The psalmist, he thinks all of his problems are permanent and absolute. His name is Heman, the guy that wrote this Psalm 88. We know that his problems are not permanent. We know that they're not absolute because Heman's prayer stays here in the Bible. And in fact, we're told who Heman is. Heman is the chairman of the Guild of Musicians and Psalmists. In other words, many of the Psalms that we read, Heman's responsible for them. And in spite of the pain that he obviously went through, in spite of the suffering and depression and fear and whatever else he was experiencing in the course of life, and despite this kind of prayer that seems unhinged, God was turning Heman into a great artist. God was turning Heman into the kind of person who would help millions of people over millennia of time. He couldn't see it, but his suffering was temporary. And I mentioned to you that, we discover the grace of God, the givingness of God in darkness. You know why? It's because God didn't bring you into his family and make you his child through your faith in Jesus because you would always smile or because you would always express some abiding confidence in him. God didn't bring you into his family simply because you would always get it right, or you'd be an unusually strong person, or add something to him along the way. No, God brings you into his family because he's a God of grace. He's the God who accepts you and loves you no matter what it is you've gone through or done. I love how 2 Timothy says it. In 2 Timothy, the writer says, this is a worthwhile saying, and he says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. You probably won't discover the depths of God's grace and the richness of God's grace until you've gone through a time where you just felt like you had nothing else to offer to God. God's not going to abandon you in the midst of your troubles. Yet one of the insidious things about mental health issues is that you feel less than because of it. You feel like it's your fault that you're depressed. You feel like it's your fault that you've got an eating disorder. You feel like it's your fault that something is broken about you on the inside. And so we can have a tendency in that setting to turn from God. But all the while, God is saying, I want you in your mess. Something else that Psalm 88, I think, teaches us is that greatness and growth come from suffering. I mentioned to you about how Heman became this great artist. Many of the Psalms he writes, you can read them. They're found in the 80s and in the 40s in the book of Psalms. But he was changed because of his suffering. And in fact, I would suggest to you, he was probably changed in ways he never would have been changed if he hadn't suffered. And it's not that God brought the pain on him for that purpose, but God is able to bring good out of it when we suffer. Look at James 1, verses 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you suffer, my brothers and sisters, whenever you suffer trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. What's James telling us? James isn't saying deny how you're suffering emotionally on the inside. He's not telling us that. He's not saying when you go through trials, just deny your capacity to grieve or to feel bad about it. That's not it. He's saying, look at it and say to yourself, hey, God can bring about good even from this. God can transform me in spite of my brokenness. But I think when I look at Psalm 88, and I read that last word, darkness is my closest friend. When I think about how these mental health issues are really a kind of darkness on the inside of you. It leads me to understand or to remember something about Jesus that puts my suffering into perspective. And here it is. The last point on your outline there. Jesus' suffering and resurrection has significance for our own suffering. You know what's important to remember about Jesus is that while we sometimes feel like we don't deserve to suffer, Jesus was the best person who ever lived. In eternity, he not only never did anything wrong, but everything that he ever did had moral perfection tied to it. Jesus never failed to do anything he should have done. He never gave in to a temptation. He never for a moment turned from God. He was perfect. But don't miss it. Jesus suffered in profound darkness. In fact, we find in the story of Jesus' crucifixion these words, Matthew 27, I'll start at verse 45. You see verse 46 there in your notes, but verse 45 says, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. Darkness came over the land. And so Jesus is being crucified. He's suffering. He's in total misery and agony there on the cross for hours. And suddenly, darkness closes in. And he knows what's happening. His Father is turning away from him. He's experiencing abandonment by God. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus suffered in the darkness. Jesus, in spite of the fact that he didn't deserve it, in spite of the fact that he had all the power, in spite of the fact that he was the creator, he bore our brokenness on himself. You might think about it like this, that Jesus was truly abandoned, so you could only feel abandoned. Jesus, he didn't abandon the cross in the hour of his darkness because he wanted to take our darkness on himself. Because Jesus didn't abandon the cross in his hour of darkness, it means he won't abandon you in yours. Listen to me. Listen to me carefully. Darkness can happen to a believer, but it doesn't mean you're lost. Darkness can happen to a believer, and it doesn't mean you've strayed. Darkness can happen without you knowing why. But eventually, there is a resolution and an answer. Darkness can happen without explanation, but God can craft purpose in it. You know, Job, in the midst of his incredible suffering and the tale of the way that Satan unleashed incredible darkness to him externally as well as internally. In the middle of Job's story, we find these words, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. About Jesus, we're told this, helps us to identify who Jesus is in the midst of our own darkness. John 1:5, the light has shined in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Jesus says this in John 12:46, I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. My friends, that's our hope today. Don't turn from God. Even if you're suffering in the darkness, remain faithful to Him. He has a way of taking pressure on a lump of coal and creating diamonds out of it. God has hope for you.